Welcome back to the Portsmouth Athanaeum. We are a research library and archives located in the heart of Market Square in downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Here at the Athanaeum, we welcome everyone who is interested in seeking knowledge, and there's always something new to learn. My name is Katy Sternberger, and I am the Athanaeum's archivist. I help to preserve historical resources of enduring value and make sure they're available to researchers like you. With the days growing shorter and spooky season upon us, it seems like an appropriate time to talk about spiritualism, which was a movement spanning the 19th and 20th centuries, and it popularized the belief that spirits of the dead desire to communicate with the living and can actually do so through the use of a medium, someone with special skills who could transmit messages between this world and the next. We can examine spiritualism through the lens of 3 Portsmouth women whose work is documented in the Athanaeum's collections. I'd like to share a book by Frances Ann Conant, a photograph of Rebecca S. Melvin, and an illustrated sheet of music with words by Celia Thaxter. So first up, let's take a look at this book called Flashes of Light from the Spirit Land through the Mediumship of Mrs. J. H. Conant. She was a spiritualist medium. Though she was known by her husband's initials, her full name was Frances Ann or Fanny Crowell Conant. She was born in Portsmouth in 1831, and she died in Boston in 1875. For 17 years, Conant held seances that were publicized in the Banner of Light, a spiritualist newspaper based in Boston and published from 1857 to 1907. The newspaper included articles on spiritualism, book reviews, poems, and a very successful column containing the transcripts of messages received through Conant during her seances. These seances took place in the newspaper's Spirit Room in Boston on a weekly basis, and there is a description of what the experience was like in the preface to Conant's book, The Seances. Tri-weekly for many years, a band of spirits have given the impromptu answers to the world's promiscuous questions through Mrs. J. H. Conant at the Banner of Light Circle Room, 158 Washington Street, Boston, Mass. The doors of that room, the walls of which are adorned with likenesses of many spirits and prominent spiritualists, and with the spirit drawings, are gratuitously opened to all comers. Not less than 100 to 125 persons are usually present at a seance. Promptly at the designated hour for meeting, Mrs. Conant takes her seat upon a platform raised about 2 feet above the floor. The doors are then locked. The medium soon passes under control, and the controlling spirit enunciates impressively and fervently a brief invocation to the Supreme Intelligence. That ended, he or she calls for any questions the chairman may have. A question, if any have been sent or handed in, is read in the hearing of the whole assembly and is forthwith replied to, sometimes in a brief monosyllable, but generally by a discussion more or less extended. The dialogue over, the controlling spirit yields possession of the medium to some other invisible. Usually at each seance, 3, 4, or more spirits successively are allowed to enunciate their wishes or sentiments at this public resort, whence the words will be sent on their way to those for whom they are specially intended. So, in front of upward of 100 people, Conant would relay messages to and from the spirits. Her question and answer sessions, originally published in the newspaper, were compiled by Alan Putnam and published in book form in 1872. Interestingly, Conant was believed to be in contact with a deceased doctor and could transmit medical advice, including instructions for treatments. If you've joined us before when I discussed the history of smallpox inoculation in Portsmouth during the 18th century, almost 100 years later, there was yet another smallpox outbreak in the Boston area in 1871. Although Edward Jenner had introduced the smallpox vaccine in 1796, there was still controversy all these years later as legislation in the United States and England started to make vaccination compulsory. Conant's book intentionally closes with a question posed by a doctor during the smallpox outbreak. Do you recommend vaccination? The reply from the spirit world via Conant was, never, never, never. It is a direct clog in the way of nature's effort to do you good. Indeed, a majority of the ills that afflict humanity may be traced back to that most terrible practice. And Dr. Jenner today, in the spirit land, mourns over its advent upon earth. With ghastly diseases such as smallpox still prevalent through the late 19th century, the threat of death still not well understood, it seems no wonder that people sought to know what messages were waiting for them on the other side. Now that we've heard what the spirits have to say, maybe you'd like to see a spirit. From the Athanaeum's collections, we have this cabinet card showing Rebecca S. Melvin. Looking closely, there is a ghostly figure that appears behind her left shoulder. Handwritten on the back of the photograph is a note explaining that Melvin believed in spiritualism. The spirit behind her has not been identified. This kind of image is called a spirit photograph. In the Victorian era, people were fascinated with death. You may have heard of hair art, which served as a way to memorialize the deceased. And as photographic technology improved and grew more readily available in the latter half of the 19th century, death photography also became popular. Sparked by the spiritualist movement, the idea of spirit photography emerged. Since photographs were a relatively new phenomenon to most people, capturing an image of a spirit seemed quite convincing, especially when paired with a strong desire to communicate with loved ones who had died. However, photograph manipulation has been around essentially since the invention of photography. Victorian photographers didn't need any fancy software or artificial intelligence to generate their images. There are a number of ways that camera lenses can produce natural artifacts on images that appear rather ghostly, such as flares or the reflection of the flash. More significantly, though, photographic plates could be used multiple times, superimposing one image over another. Critics exposed some of the prominent spirit photographers as frauds who were taking advantage of people's grief over the deceased. For a time, though, roughly coinciding with the rise and decline of the spiritualist movement, spirit photographs were a craze. Just as a medium had the skill to relay messages from the other side, so too it seemed that the novelty of the camera could show what could not physically be seen. As for the spirit photograph of Rebecca S. Melvin, it likely dates to the 1870s or 1880s, around the height of the spiritualist movement. Melvin was born in 1824 in Washington, D.C., and she died in Boston in 1901. Her parents were James Melvin and Margaret Sweat, and her mother was from Newburyport. According to the 1850 census, Rebecca Melvin, at the age of 25, was living in Portsmouth with her Aunt Caroline, who was married to druggist David Kimball. The household also included the Kimballs' 4 children and Susan Williams, a black woman who was 1 year younger than Rebecca and was likely working for the family. By the 1860 census, Melvin had moved from Portsmouth to Newburyport to live with her mother, and the 1880 census records her living in Boston with her brother, a successful apothecary. Melvin is also listed in Boston's 1899 Register of Women Voters. Even though women in the United States did not gain the right to vote until the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, in Boston since 1879, women were allowed to vote in school board elections. Many spiritualists supported causes such as women's suffrage. Coincidentally, or maybe not, Melvin's address at the time was on Washington Street, the same street where Conant conducted her seances at the offices of the Banner of Light. None of these records, however, confirm if Melvin worked as a medium. Given the controversial nature of spiritualism, it's possible that she preferred to conceal her occupation from the public record. Melvin spent her life as a single woman. Who do you suppose is the white-haired gentleman staring out from behind her in the photo? Our third connection to spiritualism is represented by this sheet of music. You may be familiar with Celia Thaxter. She is best known as a writer who lived on Appledore Island, part of the Isles of Shoals, about 6 miles off the coast of Portsmouth. She was born in Portsmouth in 1835 and died on Appledore in 1894. She wrote poetry, she wrote children's stories, she wrote about her island garden, she painted flowers in watercolor and on pottery blanks. In the summers, she hosted numerous writers, painters, and musicians in her salon. But Thaxter struggled with the long illness and then death of her mother in November 1877, prompting her interest in the spiritualist movement. She began attending seances in an attempt to contact her mother. Thaxter's experiences may have inspired her friend, Sarah Orne Jewett, to write the spiritualistic short story, The Foreigner, in 1900. In February 1877, just months before her mother's death, Thaxter published a hauntingly beautiful and almost telling poem called Sunset Song, which includes themes of nature and isolation, which were common across many spiritualistic works. The poem appeared in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Her words were actually set to music by composer Julius Eichberg. This particular sheet of music originated after the publication in the Atlantic Monthly. It's likely from 1878. It formerly had an oak frame with instructions to deliver it to Thaxter at her address in Boston, so perhaps the document could have been a gift after she lost her mother. The lines of music are in Eichberg's handwriting, and the page is covered in a graphite drawing. It's not clear who did the drawing, but it might have been Thaxter herself. It depicts a shadowy field of flowers and distant views of dark city buildings. It reminds me of the ephemerality of fall. I would now like to read Thaxter's poem, and I think we'll let her have the last word. Far off against the solemn sky, black lie the city's towers. Before me rustles, dim and dry, my field of golden flowers. How thin the wind's cool whisper draws through withered leaf and stalk. Is this the breeze that once would pause with blossoms bright to talk? Dark lies the land in twilight sad, no bird sings in its bowers. Where is the glory once that clad my field of golden flowers? The distant city rings its bells like memory's tender chime. O sweet, sweet bells, ye speak farewells to life's enchanted prime. Dark lies the land in twilight cold, gone are the sumptuous hours. The city sleeps, and shadows fold my field of golden flowers.